Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for choosing to spend 20 minutes outside of that beautiful sunshine to hear me speak about this. So today we're going to do some time travel through the last sort of 60 years to look a little bit at the history of computers and art. And I'll explain the title of my talk, or it will become more clear in a few minutes. But I did change the labeling of my talk in the schedule this morning just to add the word pen plotters in case you hadn't read into the abstract. So I'm going to kick off a Sunday morning EMF camp, EMF festival, by talking about academic articles from 1971, which I'm sure is going to get you all really excited. So I think this is interesting. So in October 1971, a gentleman called Frieder Nake published an article in Page, which is the Bulletin of the Computer Art Society, entitled "There Should Be No Computer Art." And it was a bit of a bombshell. So I'm going to read you a tiny bit from that article. Soon after the advent of computers, it became clear that there was a great potential application for them in the area of artistic creation. And he goes on later to talk about the details. Before 1960, digital computers helped to produce poetic texts and music. Analog computers, or oscilloscopes, generated drawings of sets of mathematical curves and representations of oscillations. But it was not before the first exhibitions of computer-produced pictures were held in 1965 that a greater public took notice of this threat, as some said. Progress, as others thought. I was involved in this development from its beginning onward, 1964. This is Frieder Nake, not myself. I'm a little bit younger. I found the way the art scene reacted to the new creations interesting, pleasing, and stupid. I stated in 1970 that I was no longer going to take part in exhibitions. Now, as you might imagine, as I mentioned, that was a bit of a bombshell. This is a gentleman who, for part of that previous decade, had been an insider in that movement, an advocate for algorithmic, generative computer art, who'd taken part in exhibitions around the world. He produced around 300 to 400 works in ink on a high-precision flatbed plotter during that time. And he went on to write questions like, is a computer creative, or is a computer an artist, or the like, should not be considered serious questions, period. In the light of the problems we are facing at the end of the 20th century, those are irrelevant questions. So why am I starting off a talk at electromagnetic field by reading out that piece? Well, we'll go into that. My name's Andy Piper. I live online on the Fediverse at andypiper@macaw.social. I'm at Andy Piper on most other platforms. Do not look for me on X. So we're going to take a quick trip through that 60, 70-year period of computer history, of creative technology and art. But I also want to point out that I'm not here to talk about digital art. So what I'm talking about here is the use of computers, collaborations with computers to create physical artworks, rather than only digitally. There's a ton of extra history I could go into. I don't have time in 20 minutes that talk about things like net art and interactive stuff, but we're really going to be focusing in on that physical creation and output. So to really quickly explain how I got here, why I'm on stage today. 2 years ago I was at EMF, had a lovely, lovely weekend, didn't get on stage, and a few months later I was laid off from my job, which was a wonderful job. I'm still very sad that I'm no longer in that job. But in the months that followed, my wife and I started a small maker studio, which is hosted in our local art community. And we're at a venue in South London, in Wimbledon, which is a converted paper warehouse. There's about 200 different artists in the space, in their own studios of different sizes. Painters, sculptors, photographers, ceramicists, picture framers. But we're really the only people that showed up with a load of technology. 3D printers, vinyl cutters. The studios run an art fair every 6 months, and our first one was in May last year. And by that point, my wife and I were still kind of tinkering around with our own projects. I was 3D printing some stuff. She was doing vinyl cutting and t-shirt pressing, made me this beautiful t-shirt for this talk today. We really weren't quite sure what our studio was about. But my background is in developer relations, explaining technology to people. And I've been told I'm somewhat good at that, and I really enjoy it. So I'd seen a fun drawing machine called a brachiograph described online and in magazines, and I thought I'd make one and have it on display in our studio when people came in to have a look at, and I could talk to them about it. So this is the brachiograph. I'll stand away from the name of it here, the brachiograph. This was actually invented by a gentleman called Daniele Procida, and he presented it at PyCon in the UK in 2019. So this is not new. I followed his instructions. The basic version here, as you can see, is made from 2 lollipop sticks, 3 servo motors, and a Raspberry Pi, and some wires to connect it all up, and a peg for holding the pen. Now, it costs about £20-ish to make, depending on whether you've got a Pi Zero or how much it costs you to get one of those. It's all open source, the code's all in Python, it's pretty straightforward, although there's some mathematics involved if you want to figure out all the curves and things. But it's very limited, and that's actually interesting. Sometimes when we work with limitations, that forces us to think more clearly or closely, and it helps us to learn more. At least it helps me to learn if I'm starting from the basics. Now, because it's just 2 arms and rotational joints, it can't draw straight lines. So it's kind of wiggly in the things it draws. It's also very slow. It's not super fast. But it has, I think the images have a certain charm to them. I've actually got one up at our van at the very top of the field. If you want to come and have a look at one of these, I've just got it on display. I don't have it plugged in there at the moment. But I love talking to people about it, explaining to parents that their children, they could build one together. For more detailed movement than this, you're going to need an X and a Y axis to move your tool around. And an XY robot is essentially a 2D printer. When you add the Z axis, moving up and down, squirt some hot plastic through, you've got a 3D printer. If you add a cutter head, you've got a CNC machine. So after making that plotter, I thought, okay, well, people seemed interested, and I was having fun. So I went ahead and bought. Right, so. Thank you very much. AxiDraw. Really nice. This is an A4 plotter. You can get larger ones. Really well designed, hardware. A bit more expensive than the competitors. The software is all open source, and the support is awesome. So you can see how precise this is. So. Now we've got the beach ball. Come on, you could do it. So as I was looking around at pen plotters and what other people were doing with them, I realized that this is not a new field. There is a bit of a renaissance in this space. There's some really interesting artists working with plotters. I also realized that you needed to, let's go back to the second point. While you can transform images to line art and draw them, which is what we were doing with the brachiograph, you can also drive plotters directly with code, which appealed to the tinkerer and coder in me. And finally, the thing that I think my wife and I really loved was that tangible output, which I'll come back to in a little bit if we don't completely run out of time this morning. But you're using your own materials and choices of paper and pens. Okay. Thank you. So I built another plotter that I'm going to skip over because I'd like to get to the historical part, which was a polar graph, which I used some instructions from Hackaday magazine Hackspace magazine. I love Hackaday website, but that was in Hackspace magazine to build. It looks a little bit like this, hangs on the wall, and it works with pulleys and some cotton. A little bit fiddly because you've got to move the gondola back to the middle each time. And this one is using similar technology or similar instruction sets to 3D printers. So you're using a language called G-code, using some software on the Raspberry Pi Pico, in this case called Grubble, and you fire the G-code instructions over serial connection, and away goes your plotter. So, finally getting to the point of the talk, my wife and I put out our art in our second show, and we were quite excited. I had the pen plotter, the hanging plotter on the wall, and people were generally really interested in what we were doing, the visitors to the show. But one visitor came and sort of looked at these things on the wall. My wife had this beautiful series of lighthouse pit images that she'd reprocessed into line art. I'd had these more abstract images. And this lady came and looked and said, well, where is the art? And it really goes back to that 1971 article, right, where people had been experimenting with using computers in the 1960s, and suddenly the art world had kind of said, whoa, wait a minute, what are you doing? This is witchcraft. We're not having that. So I explained to the lady that, look, I've got a background in developer relations, so I try to be patient. I think Heidi was a little less patient, but we got there, and I explained, look, my wife chose the pictures of the lighthouses to reprocess. We chose the materials. We made a number of human choices to curate this. So computers really began to be used to make images in the 1960s, and computers at the time were very large and cumbersome. They weren't portable like these laptops, probably more reliable, arguably. One of my earlier favourites is this particular one from a gentleman called Georg Knies, which you may or may not have seen. It may seem familiar to you. It's a really simple algorithm. Draw a square, continue along, and rotate it slightly, and go down. Now, this was this is now in the collection at the Victoria and Albert Museum. You can request to see it. You can now reproduce that in code very, very quickly and easily. But that was actually produced using Algol on a massive computer. I went to see it at the V&A, and you asked to see it in the reading room, and they bring out a 1 meter high lithograph on a trolley to show you, which is really quite impressive. And in the corner, you see that they were made on a Siemens System 4000. So Siemens System 4000 looks like this. I don't think there are any at EMF, but there could well be. Maybe down in Null's sector you'll find one this evening. So this was also most famously used in the 1971 Charlie and the Chocolate Factory movie, of course, to find the final golden ticket. And to create images from this, you needed to write your code on punch cards, put it into the computer, process it, get a tape out, and put that into the plotter, resulting in a drawing. Now, I'm afraid I'm going to race through. I'm happy to come and have conversations with you later if you'd like to talk some more, and hopefully there'll be a full version of this talk online at some stage. This is another example of the code from one of the things in the V&A. So people are have taken the code as the art and said, this is what output these other panels, which I think is really important, that code preservation. This is another amazing piece in the V&A, and I wish I'd taken an image of the full piece instead of taking pictures of the details. This one was actually made on a mechanical computer in 1962 by a British artist here called Desmond Paul Henry. And he converted a war analog computer that was used for finding bombs to an analog bomb site computer, I should say, to draw things. I know we're in stoppage time. If people aren't going to walk out and I'm not going to interrupt the next speaker, I'm going to continue and see how we get on. Because I think this is a particularly interesting part. There was a gentleman called Harold Cohen who was a painter originally here in the UK, and he in the 1960s started to experiment with computers, moved to California, and started to think about the possibilities of using computers to redefine his own work, giving up some of the choices he makes as an artist to computers. And he continued to impose his own rules on the output and write a program to do that. So, for example, you can go and see this in the Gazzelli Art House in London, in the Mayfair area, and it's printed, as you can see, on dot matrix paper. These are sequences of numbers, and he's applied rules to draw shapes around them, to group them. But in 1970, he had this incredible sequence where he uses a CalComp plotter to draw some overlapping shapes and then use an algorithm to label them based on what colours should border one another. And then he actually hand-coloured it, and then he came up with an acrylic version. So he came up with this concept of co-creating with his computer program, which he called Aaron. And he built machines which would enable Aaron to draw and apply colour. And over time, he actually moved on to paint as well. So Aaron actually had a turtle attached to it. And if you're anything like me and grew up in the 1980s and remember BBC Basic and Logo and all of the kind of things that came out around that time, that was a wonderful discovery to me, that there was this turtle, a physical turtle that moved around the floor of an art gallery in New York. So he came up with this wonderful piece. This was later in the 1990s. And there's a modern artist called Leisha Hay who's recently converted an AxiDraw to apply paint to her work, and I met Leisha before I learned about Harold Cohen. And now Leisha's got a solo show coming up in Gazelle House, which is where the Harold Cohen estate is based. So I think that's a lovely kind of full circle. And this is just an AxiDraw, but she's done some really cool coding to work out where the paints are and needing to wash them out and clear them. Right, okay, so you need, if you want to do some of this stuff, I'm going to race through and then we'll finish up. You need a plotter. We've talked about several types of plotter if you want to do this yourself, and I encourage you to have a look at using your computers to make art. So you could build a simple brachiograph, you could build a polar graph, you could build or buy an XY flatbed type. You're going to need some line art, because plotters can draw lines. Rather than bitmaps, you can convert bitmaps using some great software. And you need the materials, and the lovely thing about this is that you get your full choice of materials. Interesting different inks and pens, interesting different papers. If you saw us in the night market at all, or if you've been to our van up at the top field, you'll see we'll do some interesting things with black paper, fluorescent jelly roll pens. I am going to go to the end, and I do have a vintage plotter that looks like this as well, a Roland 1980s plotter. You can get some of these on eBay these days. And of course somebody's written some Python code to interface with them, which rather wonderfully is called Chipotle, which I think is just a fantastic joke. I've got one QR code for you all to scan to get hold of links if you want to from my talk or anything that I've spoken about in a much less organised manner than I hoped this morning. But there's some great tools on that page which enable us with open source software and hardware to get started. Finally, Dan Walker has already hacked his Tildagon into a plotter, so if you've got the badge, you can go and do something really cool with it. Thank you so much. Go create.